Hey guys, so first I want to thank you all for such nice comments on all my videos recently. They've just been really nice and encouraging, and I love all the questions that I'm getting. I'm trying to go through my comments, trying to set aside time to go through them and answer, so you'll see me answer in verse, but I am trying to get around to getting back to you all. So thank you so much for taking your time and commenting. It's so awesome. So today is going to be more of an educational video. I'm going to be talking about different types of feeding tubes. Now, I get this question a lot on both my feeding tube videos as well as other videos. People are wondering if I still do feeds, and I don't. I've had some questions about whether or not I go to work with it, if I take it out and all of that, and I actually don't use a feeding tube anymore. When I was about 12, I did an NG tube. I would place it myself, and I did that for a little over a year. Just while I was growing, I was having a lot of difficulty getting enough calories during the day, so I would do overnight feeds. So I placed the tube right before I went to bed, start my feeds, and then I would pull it out every morning. I don't do them anymore. My weight has plateaued where I kind of have difficulty gaining weight, but I'm also not losing weight. So yeah, I don't use a feeding tube anymore, but I place them so much, and I wouldn't say I'm used to the feeling anymore, but I don't have too much trouble placing one on myself still, just because, you know, it's kind of like riding a bike. Once you learn how to do it, you don't forget the skill. So I'm going to go through all the different types of feeding tubes. There's a number of them, and the one that I've really only talked about is an NG tube, which is generally the most popular. It's easy to place, but it's also kind of easy to rip out. I have a lot of experience with children pulling out their NG tubes and me having to replace them, which can be a little difficult on a young child because they don't really understand what you're doing. But NG tubes basically are nasogastric tubes. They go through a nostril, down the esophagus, into the stomach, and that's where they land. There are a few different ways to check placement with them. You can do the swoosh test, which is what I learned in nursing school, but realistically, we don't do that too often. But you blow a little bit of air into the tube with a syringe, and you use your stethoscope to listen right over the stomach, and you'll hear a little swoosh from the air going into the stomach. You can also check the pH to make sure that it is acidic and it hasn't gone into the trachea or, gone into the lungs, which has happened. It is a possibility. And then the third way to check, which is the absolute most accurate, is X-ray. We don't usually do that too often. We do it on kids that there is an issue. Like, I had a kid with a fistula between the trachea and the esophagus. We wanted to make sure that it was in the right place, so we would do an X-ray. NGs are nice because you can easily place them at home, so if it were to come out or it would need replacing, like it got clogged, the patient or a family member or a caregiver could do it. They usually give training just so that, they would be able to place it at home should it come out. The problem is, though, that especially with a child, it can come out pretty easy. There's no securement other than tape on the cheek, but they are the most convenient, and that's usually what they start off with. The next one is a nasoduodenal tube, which I have to be honest with you guys, I've never seen this in our hospital. We don't generally do it, but it's usually for a kid that can't tolerate feeds through the stomach. They'll throw it up, but when that happens, we usually do a nasojejunal tube. We do NGs or NJs. I've never seen an ND, a nasoduodenal tube, but they do exist. It goes a little bit past the stomach into the small intestine, into the duodenum, and it just helps with toleration of the feed. Sometimes the stomach can't handle all that formula. Now, kind of what happens if you go from an NG to an NJ or an ND tube, you have to go a little bit slower. They're usually on continuous feeds, rather than with an NG, you have the opportunity to do bolus feeds throughout the day. So that way you're not hooked up to a pump all day. Nasoduodenal and nasojejunal tubes are pretty similar. They both go past the stomach into the small intestine. It just depends on how far they go. So the duodenum is right after the stomach, and then the jejunum is a little bit further. These tubes, unfortunately, cannot be placed at home. They have to be placed in a hospital, usually with something called interventional radiology, where they have to actually see the tube go in through x-rays, I believe. So that's why we have a little bit of trouble, because they can easily be pulled out the same way an NG can be pulled out. One thing that they do is, if there is concern about somebody pulling out the NJ or the ND tube, actually I'm not sure they can do this with the ND. I don't see why they wouldn't be able to, just because it's the same tube. But there is a way for the NJ to go across nostrils to kind of lock it in place, so that when you pull it, it's like stuck in the nose up here. I've seen that on one person who was intentionally trying to pull it out. An older person that did not want it. So it's not comfortable, but that's how we keep it in sometimes. The other thing about NDs and NJs are, because you're gonna try and keep it in for a longer period of time, they generally will add an extension set onto the end of the tube, so like onto the port part, so that way you're not constantly you know, connecting and disconnecting your feed bag from it, because it kind of does get old after a while. It'll get a little bit more pliable, you know, the tubing won't stick in there as well. So if we do an extension set on there, and it looks almost identical to this, it just plugs in here, you'll be working with the extension set, and that will be the part that's getting kind of old, and you can just take that off and put on a new one. So that way you're dealing less with the actual tubes ports. It just saves it a little bit better. Now obviously it's not optimal for somebody to have a tube in long term, especially if it's in their nose. It's just not comfortable. I'll be totally honest with you. You know, when people worry about the appearance, you know, what are others thinking of them with this tube hanging out of their nose? So there are other options. They have something called a G tube. So if you tolerate NG feeds, and you know that this is something you're going to be on for a long period of time, you can do a G tube, which goes right through the abdominal skin into the stomach. And you can either have kind of like a long tubing, I believe it's called peg tubing, or you can have a button, so it's flush with the skin. And this is the same thing. You would do your feeds the exact same way, and it just kind of helps with appearance and comfort issues. Sometimes issues arise when you have the tube going straight into your stomach. Sometimes issues arise with the skin around where the tube is inserted. It can get like granulation tissue and breakdown. So a lot of people will do either gauze dressings, but sometimes they do cloth dressings, which are really cool. There's a lot of websites that you can go on and get like homemade, cute fabric cloth dressings to kind of help preserve the skin and heal it, kind of keep any drainage off of the skin. It kind of absorbs it, which is really cool. Some people will also get a J tube. I really haven't seen too many of those, to be honest with you. It's again for somebody, if they're gonna get an NJ because they can't tolerate food or formula going into their stomach, they would get a J tube, so that way it would bypass the stomach and go straight into the jejunum. But I haven't seen too many of those. What they actually do more often is something called a GJ tube or a G-jet or something like that, where it's a double port, or it is a tube within a tube, basically of both a gastric tube and a jejunal tube. So that way you kind of have both options. I have seen the tube within the tube. It's kind of cool but kind of confusing, and I don't completely understand it myself. One of the tubes goes inside of the other one, and the tube goes, I think it's the inner tube is the jejunal, and that goes further down. Obviously it goes into the jejunum, and then the larger tube is the gastric one, and that stays, you know, kind of ends in the stomach. It's very confusing. I've only seen that a couple times. More often I'll see a double port where one is a J and one is a G. And why they do that sometimes, it's pretty cool. For kids that can't really tolerate the gastric feeds, they'll do their feeds through the jejunum or the J tube, and then the other side they'll use for something called venting or draining. Sometimes there's this excess of gastric secretions, and they can actually connect a tube. Usually they use like a Ferrell bag. It's just this little, it looks almost like a feeding tube bag, but you connect it and you can either lay it on the ground or hang it up on an IV pole. If you hang it up on an IV pole, you're venting the air from the stomach, but if you bring it down to the ground, it's going to drain out all that gastric bile and just stuff that your stomach really can't handle. So if you're feeling like bloated or just really uncomfortable, we'll vent the child or vent the patient through the gastric tube, and it gives them relief. It's pretty cool. And it winds up helping a lot. Yeah, so that's the basics of feeding tubes. I know I'm just covering them very lightly. I'm giving my basic knowledge on them. Obviously, I know NG is the best because I've done them on myself. I couldn't tell you what an NJ feels like. I'm sure that it does not feel much different than an NG. I've never had any direct tubes into my abdomen. I asked about it. I remember asking about it when I was a child, but they were like, no, you can handle the you can handle it nasally, like you place it yourself, so we're not doing that. And I was like, yeah, true, let's not put me through surgery. But I'm just giving you my knowledge on it, and I feel like this might help somebody who has a doctor that's talking about possibly starting feedings in the future. So just very basic covering so you guys can understand the differences between all of them. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what videos you'd like to see in the comments. Any questions, put them below. I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. And alright, I will see you guys later. Bye!